If you're a Democratic voter, odds are, but I'm trying to do the math on this. I mean, you know, Greg Palast is estimating 4 million people will be the victims of this year. I'm guessing, based on research done by the Brennan Center, that it's going to be closer to 10 million. So if there's, 120 million registered voters and 10 million get their voting registration pulled through this new Republican scam, that's about an 8% chance you've got that when you show up to vote, if I'm doing my math in my head right, that when you show up to vote, you will be told, I'm sorry, you're not on the voting rolls. You can't vote today. Or here, we'll give you a placebo ballot. It's called a provisional ballot. We won't count it, but you can pretend to vote. Now, there's some background here, and it's really an amazing story. There's kind of two pieces to this. The first has to do with something called caging. This is something the Republican Party was busted for back in the 1980s, and there was actually a restraining order against them for about 20 years around this. And what they would do is they would mail a postcard or a letter into typically black areas, although other areas that were heavily Democratic, student areas, like college towns, were another big target for the Republican Party for these letters. And if the letter bounced back from the post office, or if the card in it wasn't returned, there were different variations on the scheme, then the Republicans would challenge the voters' registration, and if a Republican-controlled state, they'd simply be removed from the voting rolls. And they got busted for this and taken to court, and the court said, no, you can't do that. That's called caging, which is a word that goes back to direct mail days, where, I think I've told you before, back in the 80s, I owned a company and an ad agency in Atlanta, and Lamar Waldron, in fact, who co-authored our books on JFK with me, he ran our direct mail division, as it were. And we had seminars. I'd teach probably 40 or 50 of these a year around the country, and we had 6 people who were teaching them, me and Sky Leininger and Dave DeBronkart and a few other people, teaching these workshops all around the country for corporations, government agencies. I mean, we trained the CIA, the NSA, the Army, on how to do internal communications, newsletters, and external marketing. And so we would mail typically 2 or 3 million pieces of mail a month. And, you'd get the dead mail back. It would come back with, undeliverable on it. And those would be segregated by our direct mail people. And we didn't do it ourselves. We contracted it out. But, they'd have these big warehouses where they print and ship this stuff. And they would take the dead letter stuff, and put it literally in a cage in a separate part of the warehouse, so that later on they could put those names into the database and delete them, so that we didn't have to pay postage to mail to people who had moved or were dead. So when Republicans, and it was called caging in direct mail, and it was called caging then. So that's part one. So just keep that in your brain. Part two depends on this very simple principle that when it costs you money to vote, you're less likely to vote regularly than when you can vote and it doesn't cost you money. This is why, in the 1880s, after the collapse of Reconstruction, conservatives, particularly across the South, started putting poll taxes into place, where if you wanted to vote, you had to pay, $5, $10, $20, $30, whatever it was. Typically, it wasn't a lot of money. It was just enough that somebody who was, really poor would be discouraged from voting. And then they also, in the South, when they did this, they would have this exception to the poll tax. If you declared an oath, if you raised your hand and said, I swear that a relative of yours had voted before the Civil War, then the poll tax was suspended. Now, this continued up until 1966 in states like Georgia. This was shot down by the 24th Amendment in 1964, but it wasn't tested before the Supreme Court and certified, as it were, until 1966. And of course, the only people voting before the Civil War were white people, in the South anyway. And so by declaring that you had ancestors who had voted before the Civil War, what that meant was black people couldn't vote or had to pay the poll tax, and white people didn't have to pay the poll tax. So Republicans have been trying for years to figure out, well, ever since 1966, how can we put a poll tax back into place? And the scheme they came up with is elegant, simple, and mind-boggling. What they figured out is that people who work for a paycheck based on an hourly wage have to pay to vote because they lose wages when they show up to vote. And people who are salaried, doesn't cost them anything to vote because they get the same paycheck every month whether they, show up for 8 hours on a particular day or 6 hours. So the way that they used to deal with this was by cutting back on the number of voting machines and closing polling places so that particularly in black neighborhoods in the South, you could wait 6, 8, literally 10 hours in line to vote. But the problem the Republicans had is that, starting pretty much, around the 2004, 2008 elections, and Barack Obama was talking about this a lot when he was president, these 6, 8, 10-hour-long lines started getting a lot of publicity. And it was very embarrassing to these Republicans down in the South, that this kind of crude method of, making it expensive for people to vote. So they came up with a brand new strategy. And it was John Husted in Ohio who really was the genius behind this, apparently. He's the Secretary of State of Ohio. And he was like, well, okay, people who have an hourly wage, he didn't say this, but this is the logic. People who have an hourly wage, it costs them money to vote, so they're not probably going to vote in every election. They're just going to vote in the big elections, the national presidential elections. They'll probably ignore the midterms because, hey, they don't want to take time off work. Whereas, and that's principally Democratic voters. Up to 63% of hourly workers, according to one study, are Democratic voters. Over 65% of salaried workers are Republican voters. And so, for salaried workers, they vote every single time. So Husted's idea was, let's send a caging letter. In other words, you got to mail this letter back saying, yes, I still live at this address. Let's send a caging letter only to people who have missed an election in the last, 4 or 6 years. And that way, we're targeting those Democratic voters. We'll leave alone the Republican voters. And it works. And Husted did this, and he got sued by the ACLU and the NAACP in 2018 or 2017. It went to the Supreme Court. And in 2018, Sam Alito wrote a 5-4 decision where 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court said, this is cool, no problem. And Sam Alito, in fact, opened the decision by saying, there's millions of people on the voting rolls who are at the wrong address and have moved. Well, which is true, of course. I've lived in New Hampshire, Vermont, Michigan, Georgia, Germany, Oregon. Every time I move, I don't call the old Secretary of State. Typically what states do is they remove you from the voting rolls when your driver's license doesn't renew or when you stop paying state taxes. But that takes a couple of years. So Husted said, this is our way of keeping the rolls clean. So now that this has the legal approval of the Supreme Court, all across the nation, Republican-controlled states are purging. Palace is estimating it's going to be 4 million people this year. I'm estimating it's going to be 10 million, but, Greg is more of an expert on these things than I am. In fact, we should probably get him on to talk about it. But it's just, this is the new scam. So if you live, particularly if you're black or you live in a college town, or if you live in a neighborhood that has a lot of black people in it, double check your voter registration. Because this is the scam that the GOP is most relying on this year and that the media is most not talking about. Nobody's discussing this. And it's a BFD. Check it out. It's at HartmannReport.com.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
18 minutes past the hour. Got to talk about our strategy around the Republican strategy on abortion right after this.